This is Biblical Theology of the Old Testament 2, which has a better name, which is, The Prophets and Their Message. What we're going to be doing is that we're going to be looking at the Old Testament prophetic literature, and don't worry, you're not going to be reading through verse by verse all of the prophets, because we don't have time to do that. But what we are going to do is that we're going to see how the Old Testament prophets take the materials that we looked at in the first course, the covenant materials, for example, the Abrahamic covenant and the priestly covenant and so on, and how they use them, how they work with them, how they take the portrait and the promises of Christ, which we looked at, and develop them. The prophets are all about developing what went before. And in their development of that material, they give us more revelation, more information. And I suppose one of the things that I'm going to be repeating over and again in this course is that they are concerned to paint a picture. And that picture becomes very vivid by the time that they stop their ministry with Malachi circa 450, 475. By that time, what we'll see is that the prophets lead people to expect certain clear things. So these things are both taken from what went before, in the Pentateuch particularly, developed by the different prophets, writing from around about the middle of the 8th century BC through to about the 5th century BC. And by the time we get into the period approaching the New Testament, there is a definite expectation that people who are reading that literature have, and that's the expectation that I want you to have as well. I mean, as much as possible. What I want you to do is to try to imagine as much as you can that these books are being read by you for the first time. I know that's kind of impossible, but try and fool yourself, because if you do that, then what I'm trying to get across, I think, will come across more powerfully. And you'll also be ready for the next course, which I know that you'll all sign up for, which deals with the New Testament and how the New Testament authors deal with all of this material and all of these expectations that we'll be developing. What I need to do is just say a few boring general remarks, and then we'll get into a review of the first course. I know some of you weren't there for the first course, so I'm going to review some of the major teachings that we did then. Then I want to develop something of what I call the downward spiral. Things went really to pot, didn't they? Time of the end of Joshua and then Judges, Samuel. I mean, you really get fed up with Israel. And they go about as far away from God as anyone can go. And yet God is faithful to them. And even in the midst of that, raises up his king, David, in the 11th century. Things go to pot again, of course, and then you get the prophets coming. You get Elijah and Elisha, people like that, prophesying in around about the 9th century. And then the writing prophets come up, which is what we are particularly concerned with in this course. And once I've painted that picture a little bit, I want to ask this question. What is a prophet? What is a prophet? And that's when we'll open our Bibles. So today we're not going to be opening our Bibles very much because there's a lot of review going to be done. But we are going to be opening our Bibles a lot. You will need a notebook if you want to get the most out of this course. Some of you are very smart people and you can just take it all in and absorb it, I understand. But then some of you if you're like me, you just need to write it down. And so I do recommend that you do that to get your money's worth and, just retain the material. I will not make the mistake of asking you what you're doing on your phone this time. I really have something against technology. I'm anti-technology. You can use your phones and use your stuff, but just don't do it in front of me too much, okay? It just puts me off. I really think, I have a Christian view on this. I think that it's not just me being weird. It actually has to do with the fact that technology takes from people. It takes away. It doesn't just provide some kind of thing that you can use. It actually takes. It always asks more than it gives. There was a French polymath by the name of Jacques Ellul who wrote about this in the 1940s and the 1950s. And he wrote a book called The Technological Society, and that's before all of this, cell phones and all of these other things. But it was at the onset of the modern scientific and technological revolution. And what his concern was in his books was with what he called technique. And by technique, what he meant was that the computers that were coming out and all of the different ideas for, space age and so on, and the advent of a wonderful future world that people back then thought they would create, that could not be achieved by means of technology. And the reason is that technology doesn't have a soul. It always demands and intrudes. What I mean by that is that, or what he meant by that, is that once you use technology, then you have an advance in that technology, and that advance in technology, it might cut corners for you, but it also carves out a little niche for itself, which you once occupied. And so it kind of, takes the soul, sucks the soul out of you. All right? I've just been in Amish country, by the way, and they believe that if you take photos of them, that you take their soul away. I don't believe that, but I do believe that some of you who are overly dependent on technology, I do believe your soul is withering inside. So, but that's up to you.
It's pretty evident. It's pretty evident.
All right. I'm not going to say anything else about that. Let's see, anything else? Any questions anyone has about just the way that this course is going to go? Then I'll say some more. Questions. If you want to ask a question, put your hand up, and I will either tell you that it's a good time or not a good time to ask the question. The reason that I do that is not because I'm a meanie, it's because when I get going on a train of thought, I don't like to interrupt it, because sometimes I forget what I'm saying otherwise. And the other reason is because I will probably answer your question if you give me time. Just because I've been teaching this stuff for so long that I kind of know what kinds of questions come up. So just give me time. I also want to stop you from asking a question that you will leap to that will take us way off track. What we need to do is that we need to be patient in this very impatient world, and we need to kind of incrementally learn things. Sometimes, for some of you, that might feel as though you're dying a little bit because you've got this stuff that you need to get answered. I will ask you just to be patient, to learn the stuff that you are taught, think about that, and then as we move forward, I think that you'll be actually better prepared to sit down with an open Bible and be patient with what it's telling you, rather than reading what you want into it. This is where I feel like talking about fluffy devotionals, but I'm not going to. I'm going to move on, resist the urge, and we'll start with a review of the first course. Hello. Hi. Glad you came. All right. So last time what we did, can you all see behind these rude pillars? All right. Can you see? All right.
I can sit right next to Melissa.
Okay. I mean, I can move this too, maybe. If I move it forward, would it help?
Yes.
Yeah. All right. Let's see. How's that? Okie dokie. So some things that are important that we looked at last time, which I will be referring to and which I think will help you. The first thing is that we would do well to look at God's creation of the world as a project. The reason it's a good idea to do that is because unlike the false gods, the pagan gods, the God who is real knows what he's doing. He doesn't trip over his own feet. He doesn't, plan things that he has no idea what he's going to do, how it's going to turn out. He's not caught out by his creatures, even if his creatures turn out to be as rotten as we are and are disobedient like we are. He knows the end from the beginning. In Acts chapter 17, James in that, no, 15, sorry, Acts 15, James in that Jerusalem assembly, he says, known from the beginning of the world are God's ways, okay? Something like that. In other words, God knew what he was going to do before he even created the world. Now that's really important to keep in mind. Remember also about Christ. He's what? The Lamb who was slain before the foundation of the world. So before the world was made, it was already in the mind of God that A, we'd fall, that B, he would love us enough to come into the world to save us, and therefore that he knew what that salvation would entail at the end. We haven't reached the end yet. The end is going to be glorious. The end is going to be truly amazing because it's wrought by the suffering and by the blood of God's own Son. This Sunday, I'll be preaching on the agony in the garden in Gethsemane. And in that passage, remember that Jesus, he is said to be extremely troubled, greatly agitated. And he even tells that, he divulges that to three of his disciples, doesn't he? He says that my soul is tumulted, he says, even unto death. And then he wants three of the disciples to pray for him. Of course they don't. But he goes, and what does he pray? He's Son of God, knows the plan of God, all of that stuff. What does he pray? If it's possible, let this cup, let this time pass from me. Why does he do that? Now, he knows what the will of God is. Why does he do that? Because of the tension, the pain, the overwhelming immensity of what he's about to do. That overwhelms the cold, calculated, yeah, I'm going to do this. This is the plan. I know how it's going to end up. And let's just do this thing. Rather, he enters into suffering in this world. And for that kind of suffering to have been necessary, and it was necessary. The agony in the garden was necessary. It was necessary for Christ to shed those great drops of blood, to be that anxious as a human being. Because that was necessary, don't you think that what comes out of that finally is going to be, well, beyond what we can even ask or think? The difference between this world and the world to come is truly one that cannot be entered into by us. We can enter somewhat into Christ's suffering, and we can identify somewhat with that, can't we? Yes?
A little. Just a little.
Yeah, I mean, some of us have really been kicked around. So, I mean, yeah, to a greater or lesser extent. We understand pain. We understand sorrow. But at the same time, what we can't understand is how the whole shooting match is going to end up. Because it's going to end up not just kind of our standard of perfection, but God's standard of perfection. Not our standard of beauty and our standard of proportionality and all the rest of that. That's the art thing coming out. But God's. And if you want to enter into the proportionality of God, you enter into the way that the grass and the trees and the sky and the sun, they're all so different, and they're all different colors, and yet they go together so wonderfully, don't they, even in this world? And that will be intensified when Christ returns. And the power to do that is in his suffering and in his death and in his resurrection, which we'll enter into.
Amen.
So, where was I? The creation project. So, yes, I was saying I was going to preach on it. I was going to preach on it this Sunday, not now. Okay, so we need to see that this is a project that God has set in motion. And when we see the world as a project, and this is where we get some of my art. Okay, so that's the world as it was originally created. That's exactly what it looked like. And it's going to end up, okay, in a more glorious world. So we'll do some of this here, so you'll know that means it's going to be a glorious world. In between here is a plan that God is working out right now. The only question that we need to ask is, how does the Bible and what the Bible tells us, how does that help us to understand the beginning from the end? And how much detail can we fill in between these 2 points? I think if we actually believe what God says, we can fill in quite a lot. We certainly can't fill in everything, but we can fill in quite a lot. And there are different ways that we can do this. One of the first ways is we can actually believe what God says, which is, what some people seem to have a real problem with. It's one thing, by the way, it's one thing to not believe what God says or have trouble believing what God says when you're in trouble. And when the sky's falling in and everything looks grey, it's sometimes difficult to grasp hold of that, but faith helps us to grasp hold of that, even when we don't feel like grasping hold of it. But it's quite another thing altogether when God tells us very clearly in his word what he's going to do, how he's going to do things. Then we have a choice about whether we're going to listen or not. And that choice very often is dictated by our presuppositions, especially our assumptions about what we think the New Testament demands our allegiance to. Do we believe, for example, that the church is it. It's all about the church now. After all, we're part of the church. We have a vested interest in God, doing great things with the church. And we might feel as though in being cheerleaders for the church, we are, that's all that God cares about, just us and what we're doing. But the Old Testament, you see, builds a picture for us which seems to contradict that, at least on the surface, because it talks about this bunch of people called Israel in a nation, in a land. And there's a lot of particularity, a lot of specification that's given about Israel. Many people in evangelicalism today believe that God is, in one way or another, saying it nicely or very bluntly, through with Israel. The nice way of saying it is that God will save those Israelites, those Jews that will believe in Christ just before Christ returns. That's a nice way of saying it. That's a polite way of saying it. To get behind what they mean by that, just mention the nation of Israel and the national promises, and you'll see that what they really mean is that the church has replaced Israel. Do you see? If you say that, then you have to go back into the Old Testament and you have to do what?
Look at it.
Well, you have to turn it actually into a Christian book. Do you see? You have to make it something that preaches well for you. And so you will tend to just take the stories of Scripture and make nice little moral stories out of them and apply them to you or to other people's situations. Maybe you'll go to Proverbs and believe some of that stuff. But what you'll tend to do is, particularly when you meet the prophetic scriptures, you'll start to fiddle with them somewhat so that the church actually becomes the point of it all, rather than who it says it's directed to, which is the nation of Israel and David's throne and so on and so forth. Are you familiar with this kind of thinking? Yes? All right. At the end of the last course, I came and brought in a few big tomes and read from them. So those of you that were here, I think about 3 of you were here. But those of you that were here will recall, hopefully, some of the impression that maybe was made on you by these scholarly works. They were very blunt about the fact that the church is it, that God is through with Israel, and that the way to interpret the Old Testament is to, I'd use the word spiritualize. They would use nicer words like transform or expand, because we're in that kind of age now when you don't say what you really mean. You say it nicely in another way so that people will think that you don't mean what you really mean. But this is the prevailing view that's being taught to students nowadays. It's the prevailing view in many pulpits, not in this one, by the way, in this church, that the church is the new Israel. And the old Israel, which is the one that's hanging out in the Middle East causing all of that trouble, they need to get with a plan and believe on Christ, and they'll be incorporated into the church, which is the true Israel. I'm pointing to this right now because I want you to, at least to get the heads up to the fact that A, I think that's a load of rubbish, and B, that you cannot do what we're trying to do in these classes and take that position. You cannot have a head full of what you think the New Testament says and freight it back into the Old Testament and say, yeah, but what about this? And what about this New Testament passage? And what about Paul here? And what about so-and-so? And if any of you do that, by the way, I'll just tell you to wait until the next course, and I will tell you to pay attention to what God is saying in the context. Because guess what? Just because you've got the New Testament doesn't mean that the prophets had it, and doesn't mean that the people that the prophets wrote to had it. In fact, it doesn't mean that the earliest Christians had it. I hope that you realize that even though the last book of the New Testament, the book of Revelation, was written about AD 95 at 96, that it was rare for Christians to have a complete New Testament. The Gospels would circulate, the four Gospels would circulate together in the first and second centuries. Let's say that I take the traditional date. So let's say Matthew wrote circa 45 to 47, Mark say 51, Luke around about 58 to 62, and then John 85 to 90. Those Gospels would circulate together as a group. Sometimes the book of Acts appended to Luke. And churches would have those Gospels. And then you would have the 12 epistles of Paul, and usually Hebrews lumped in as well. And no, I don't believe Paul wrote Hebrews. If that makes me a heretic, I'm sorry, but I don't. But you would have those lumped together, but they would circulate separately. And then you'd have the general epistles, and they would circulate separately, but they wouldn't circulate at the same frequency. You wouldn't have as many manuscripts of the the general epistles as you would of Paul. You wouldn't have as many manuscripts of Paul as you would have of the Gospels. And so many of the early Christians wouldn't have encountered an entire New Testament. Not even Augustine, actually, in the 5th century, had an entire New Testament. Now, if you have a belief that you have to have a New Testament to interpret the Old Testament, I hope you can see that the earliest Christians were in a bit of bother, weren't they? Because they didn't have one. So I think it's wise to kind of, if any of you have those kinds of assumptions, and maybe you don't, I'm looking around to see if I can spot one of you. Are you twitching or anything like that? But if any of you have, you feel like shooting a hand up and asking about what about, because you think a New Testament passage contradicts what I'm saying, just hold off, okay? Because what we will see is that God actually knows what he's doing, and he doesn't need your help or my help to say what he means to say. The only thing that God requires from us is what?
Love and obedience.
Faith, yes. He wants us to believe him. Believing God sometimes means that we don't understand what he's doing. So I put a lot of emphasis the last time on Genesis 22 and God taking Isaac up Mount Moriah. Not God, Abraham. Taking Isaac up Mount Moriah. By the way, if I do that, just correct me. Okay? And he was going to sacrifice his son. Please don't think that he did it coolly and calmly and without any emotion. Please don't think that he wasn't extremely troubled, extremely sad at the position that God had put him in. He could not fully figure out why God said it. And yet he did it, didn't he? He was about to kill his son because he believed what God said. That's faith, guys. That really is faith. Okay? If what I'd have done, what many people nowadays who spiritualize the Bible would do, is I'd just baptize a sheep, call it Isaac, and kill that. Take that up Mount Moriah and kill that. That would be spiritualization, wouldn't it? Which is what a lot of people do. But Abraham did not spiritualize the Bible. Abraham took God at face value. And so he took his son up to Mount Moriah and was prepared to sacrifice him with all of the confusion and all of the emotional trauma that would have brought upon him, because he believed that even though he didn't figure it all out, he didn't know exactly why, he trusted that God did. And that's what we are going to do when we are tempted to ask questions about, well, how does the church fit into the kind of picture that we will be coming up with when we're studying the prophets. We're just going to say, well, it doesn't matter right now. We're just going to see what the Bible says. We're going to paint the picture irrespective of what we think we know is down the road, and try to get the same kind of picture, the same kind of expectation that Peter, James, John, Matthew, and the rest of them would have had. Because when we're there, I think that you'll find that we can step into their time, step into their mindset much easier than if we foolishly try and read the Bible backwards because we think we know how it's all going to end up. Anything on that?
Makes sense.
Good. That's what I like to hear. I like to hear people agree. Yes. All right. So a couple more things here, and I'm sorry if some of this is rather rudimentary or a little bit boring, but it's kind of important that we put this foundation down. So in Genesis chapter 1, but we see it all over the place. Genesis chapter 1, you have this to and fro between God saying, let us make, and then so God did it. Yeah? Let there be light, and there was what? Light. Yeah, not a Tonka truck or something different than light. There was light. You even have repetitions, so that you have, for example, let us make, and I should really open my Bible and read this, but it says, let us make trees and it has the seed in itself and grass and herb yielding seed and all of that stuff, and let them reproduce. I mean, that's a Henebury translation, but and then what it says is exactly the same thing in the next verse. It's almost, it's like, okay, I get it. Why do you have to repeat it? Just say he did it. But he says exactly the same thing in the next verse, so that you will know that there is a correspondence between what God says and what God does. And remember, that was an important motif that I wanted to bring out. Now, I'll be emphasizing this more. God's words and God's actions. If you keep in mind that God does what he says he's going to do, that there is a correspondence between God's words and then God's actions that follow that, then that will really help you to interpret the Bible. It's a simple thing, isn't it? And where does that come from? It comes from the Bible itself. Genesis chapter 1 actually gives you what's called a hermeneutical base for the interpretation of the rest of the Bible. Just think about, a few different incidents. So the Tower of Babel, for example, Genesis chapter 10. So the Tower of Babel, God says, let us go down and there confuse their language. And then what does he do? He does what he says he's going to do, doesn't he? Yeah. see another one. When Naaman is told in 2 Kings chapter 5 that he is to dip 7 times in Jordan, he gets all irate about it. Then his servants come to him and they say, well, look, what if he's asked you to do some great thing about it? Why don't you just do what he says? And when he submits to that and humbles himself, what happens? Exactly what Elisha told him would happen. Why? Because God means what he says, that's why. Because there's a correspondence between God's words and then God's actions, or between what God says and the result that he's promised. When you trust in Jesus Christ as your personal Saviour, is it a big surprise what's going to happen? I mean, it might be existentially something happened to you, but as far as, do you expect to be saved? Yes, you do, because why? Because that's what God says you're going to be if you trust in Jesus. Do you see? It's very important that that very simple lesson is not forgotten. There's a lot of pressure to forget that when we're reading the Bible, especially the Old Testament. And we're going to come across it, but I'll try to kind of avoid it and go around it in this course, because we'll meet it full force in the next course. You see, I'm already setting you up. This is kind of the carrot and stick thing, okay? All right, there was something else. God's language is very clear. He means what he says. And there's a correspondence between these things. I could bring out many of these things. In fact, if you go quickly to John 21, I think it's either 19 and 20 through 21 or 21 through 23. It's when Peter's asking about what will this guy do? Yeah? 21. Can you read just that passage, 21 through, it might be 21 and 22. I'll tell you, read 21 through 23, and I'll tell you to stop if you're going too far, okay?
Peter, seeing him, said to Jesus, "But Lord, what about this man?" Jesus said to him, "If I will that he remain till I come, what is that to you? You follow me." Then the saying went out among the brethren that this disciple would not die. Yet Jesus did not say to him that he would not die, but, "If I will that he remain till I come, what is that to you?"
That's it. All right. So look at that passage. What's going on?
Somebody's meddling in somebody else's relationship.
Well, that's going on. But can you see there's a problem of interpretation that's at the center of that? Jesus said, in answer to Peter's question, if I will that he remains until I come, what is that to you? You follow me. Then what does the next verse say? How did they interpret that? Where did they get that from? Where did they get that from? From what he said?
That he will remain until I come. They took off.
Yeah, they kind of, yeah.
Well, if I were to say this.
Yes. But what was being employed there for them to come up with that stuff? What kicked in? Some of you, to show that you were awake in the last course, I'm expecting some of you to chip in here.
The resurrection is it?
No. Assumptions. Okay. They were employing their unaided human reason to reason to a false conclusion. That is a false interpretation. And we do that all the time. We read the Bible and then we go off, we swan off into some kind of interpretation that we dream up. It didn't say that, but we think we know, but we know what it really means. And it really means this, and then we go off on our merry way. We do that because we intrude our own reason into Scripture. And we do it a lot. That's where you get all the different denominations from, by the way. That's where you get these arguments from those people who disagree with you, who are just wrong because they disagree with you. That's where you get that from, because you say, well, look, what does it say? And it's like they can't see what it says. There's a block there, yes? Why? Because they've already imposed a meaning on it, not from what it says, but from what they've thought it says. It makes sense to them. So then that, forever and a day, is going to be what that passage means. Do you see? And if you do that, and I do that sometimes, I've tried to stop myself over the years, but if you do that, you're in very good company, because that's what the disciples did too. But then, look what the next verse says. You read it out. But he did not say that. Jesus did not say that. But, and then do you see, he repeats exactly the same words as he said before. Why did John put that in there? I mean, he says at the end of his gospel, he could have put a whole lot more stuff in there, couldn't he? So that all the books of the world wouldn't contain all the things that Jesus said and did. Well, why did he put that thing in there then that Jesus said? Why? It's a warning. It's a warning about misinterpreting the Bible because you're not paying attention to what God says. Do you see? It's easy to do, but don't do it. Try not to do it. I mean, just really train yourself to go slowly, pay attention to what it's saying, and resist the urge to say, I know where this is going. Then we looked into the biblical covenants. The first biblical covenant is the Noahic covenant. Does anybody here have a problem telling me what the Noahic covenant was all about? Be bold, tell me. This is not a trick question. Well, it had to do with the rainbow. Rainbow was the covenant token, but what was it about? That's too general. Tell me about what it was about. What happened to the land and what happened to the people? It was about... But what was the Noahic covenant about? That he wouldn't do it again. You see? He wouldn't destroy the world with a global flood the way that he'd done it before. Remember?
Well, he just said he wouldn't do it that way.
Yeah, but he wouldn't do it with a flood. That's right.
I'm not going to flood it again. Next time we'll be fire.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. All right. Yeah. Where'd you get that from, John?
I think it was John.
Okay. Do any of you have a problem with what the Noahic covenant says, with understanding it or believing it?
No, just think.
Anyone have a problem with believing it? Does any of you think that God's going to bring a global flood again? Why not?
Because he said
He promised. He promised.
Well, he did more than promise. He made an oath. And when you make an oath, you bind yourself to the words that you utter in that oath. And remember, one of the things that we did last time is that we paid attention to the fact that, therefore, the words of the oath cannot be ambiguous. They can't be something that, a couple of years down the road, people will say, well, I never said that. All right, well, I didn't mean that. by this word I meant this. Do you see? No, you have to pick the words carefully so that what is being agreed upon and what's being understood and the expectation that's being aroused by that oath is clean and clear, yes? And all of you got that right. Yeah, you're 4,000 years removed from the Noahic covenant, but you didn't have any problem with it, did you? That's the first covenant that God made. It's a unilateral covenant. Noah had to build a boat, but God didn't even say build a boat and that's part of the oath. That's part of the covenant. He stepped off the boat, offered the sacrifice, and then God himself made the oath. It involved God. Just says, I'm not going to do this again. And here's a rainbow to make so you can see that I'm not going to do it. And I'm going to look at the rainbow too. That's the first covenant. And it's unambiguous. It's easily understood. The second covenant is the Abrahamic covenant. The Abrahamic covenant has 3 prongs to it, which we're not going to go into, but we'll explore as we go through this course. The first one has to do with Abraham's seed, his descendants, and that his descendants would be like the sand of the sea and so on.
No, the sand of the sea.
Sand of the sea, stars in the sky, yeah.
Nations will be blessed.
Well, I'm not on that one yet. I'm on the first bit. All right. The second one has got to do with the land that is given to Abraham. And it was a particular land. If it was the whole earth, he may as well have stayed in Ur of the Chaldees. But he had to be brought from there into a particular place, into Canaan, which is now Israel. And then the third prong had to do, and through you all the nations of the world, or peoples of the world, will be blessed. 3 prongs, okay? And those were repeated over and over again. They were repeated to Abraham, they were repeated to Isaac, and they were repeated to Jacob, and then they were also repeated in different times to Israel as well. Then you have the Mosaic covenant, and the Mosaic covenant it's not a unilateral covenant like the first 2. It's a bilateral covenant. And this bilateral covenant is found in Exodus 24, where God has given the 10 Commandments and he's given them all of these rather difficult norms that they have to keep to. And these are written in a book. And then what happens is that Moses is said to have read the book out to the people, say, well, will you agree to this? So that's the oath. It's a big, long oath. Takes probably a few hours to read the whole thing out. But, will you do this? Do you agree to do this? And enter into covenant with God. And they say, yeah, sure, we'll do that. And so what does he do? He dips the hyssop into the blood of the animal, and he sprinkles the book, and then he flings it on the people too, to show that they are in covenant with God and they better hold up their part of the covenant. God's certainly going to hold up his part. The problem is with the human element. And of course, very quickly, Exodus 35, they find themselves getting fed up with all of that, and they want Aaron to make these golden calves, and the bacchanalial starts from that. That's a unilateral covenant. It's broken by Israel to show that Moses, who's coming down at this time, he breaks the tablets in his annoyance with the people. But God, because he's gracious, because he's a good God and he's a long-suffering God, he gives them another chance. And so Moses has to go up the mountain again and get some more. And the history of Israel really is a history of God's faithfulness in the midst of repeated unfaithfulness of his people. Repeated failures for them to hold up to their part of the bargain. But you see, because it's a unilateral covenant and because human beings have a propensity to mess things up, it cannot ever be normative. Do you see? It can't ever be something that is eternal, because we just can't do our part. None of us. I mean, we're all the same as they are. We look at Israel and we get fed up with reading the book of Numbers because they're always messing up. But if we'd have been there, we'd have been the same way, wouldn't we? We get fed up of ourselves. I get fed up of myself all the time. Because I know I'm not what I ought to be. Nothing close to what I ought to be. And even when I'm letting myself off the hook or comparing myself with others, I'm not as bad as that person. I'm still telling myself, yeah, but you're still a stinking worm for even saying that, aren't you? So we just can't, we don't cut it. That means that the Mosaic covenant has to be replaced. It's called the Old Covenant in the book of Hebrews, and it's replaced by what? Surprise, surprise, the New Covenant. And the New Covenant is not a bilateral covenant. Okay, we don't agree to do anything apart from believe on the merits of someone else, but it's all him. That's the only kind of covenant that works. It's the only kind of covenant that we can rely on, because those covenants rely on the character of God, who never fails. Then you have the priestly covenant in Numbers 25, and the priestly covenant is given to Phinehas. And remember what happened there? After the debacle of Balaam trying to curse Israel and ending up blessing Israel, that didn't work out very well. Then Balak was getting rather irate with Balaam and deciding that he wasn't a good deal. So Balaam gave up the prophesying and instead worked out an intermingling of the peoples. And that intermingling of the peoples worked because, the men saw the Canaanite women saw the Jewish men or whatever. And what happens in situations like that happened very, very quickly. I mean, it was alarming, so much so that you read this terribly distressing situation in Numbers 25 where that man brought in the Midianite woman right in front of the noses of Moses and the leaders, and went into his tent, and they were having a nice time of it until Phinehas got a javelin, went into the tent and thrust them through. Do you remember? Now, God liked what Phinehas did. Thousands of people had died because of the plague that God had wrought because of that transgression. And it was Phinehas' zeal that stopped God's hand, stopped the plague from continuing. And so God then, Phinehas wasn't expecting this, but God said to him, because you have shown my zeal for Israel in doing this, that he promised an everlasting covenant of peace with Phinehas and his descendants. Now, Phinehas was the grandson of Aaron. A Levite, in fact, the high priest. An everlasting covenant. Now, if an everlasting covenant's been given by God to a priestly family, a priestly line, I hope that you can see, and by the way, it has to do with offerings as well before God. I hope that you can see that as far as that passage is concerned, it appears as though there has to be a continuation of that line in the ministries of Israel before God. Well, we know it's stopped now because God is dealing with the church and he's not dealing directly with Israel. But because it's an everlasting covenant, an everlasting oath that God has entered into, I hope you can see that he can't just decide that he didn't say it. He has to make good on that covenant. And we'll see that the prophets pick up on that. They really take God at his word there, and they have no problem in citing that covenant. It's one that we don't know very much about, but it's there in the Bible, and we will see that it entails that in the future kingdom there will be a temple and there will be sacrifices. You say, well, yeah, but the book of Hebrews says. Yeah, but the book of Hebrews in the New Testament, we're not in the New Testament right now, so we'll just stick with what the Old Testament says, and we will, what? We will just be patient, okay? And maybe I'll answer that question in the next course, and maybe not. But even if I can't answer it, it's not going to stop what God said. Do you see? Even if I can't answer it, God can. And so our faith is in what? The powers of our intellect or our abilities to deduce what God really meant, or in just believing what God has told us and leaving the rest up to God. What are covenants? Covenants are then basically, they are amplifications of plain speech, clear speech about something very important. It's a very pedestrian way of describing it, but it's a useful way. They are amplifications of plain speech about very important things. The flood, that's kind of big, major. Abraham, that's major. The priesthood, that's major. David, that we'll look at, the Davidic covenant, the kingship, that's pretty major. New covenant, your salvation, I would think that would be major. It's about major stuff. Now, because it's about major stuff, please understand that these covenants must mean what they say. They're God telling you what God's going to do. And this must mean, because covenants can't be spiritualized or twisted or forgotten about, they must come through. God imposes an obligation upon himself when he enters into these covenants. Because that's the truth, nothing else in the Bible can cross what those covenants say. Do you see that? Anyone feel bold enough to tell me why? It would make God a liar, wouldn't it? Yes. Yeah, it would make him a false witness.
God is not disingenuous.
Right. You've been reading my stuff. Good. God, because these are about major things, okay, they are God telling us the major things that he's going to do. if he's going to do them, then I hope that you can see that he doesn't work at cross purposes to himself and his own plans. Therefore, a teaching that we might introduce because we think that we understand something about the Bible that, Henebury doesn't, or whatever, which is possible. But this, it's not unlikely at all. But this, I hope that you can see, if you're introducing something that's going to cross these covenants, then you're going to threaten the covenants. And if you're going to threaten the covenants, you are threatening the character of God and his promise. Do you see? And that's the importance of the covenants, that they are, in a sense, a skeleton or a backbone or I'm trying to think of the right word, signpost, framework, whatever, think of one, that tell us what God is going to do. They set forth the program of God in this creation project, do you see? And it's not yet fulfilled. There's a lot of it that is still to come. And one of the things that we're going to see when we look at the prophets is that we're going to see that their prophecies about this golden age and these wonderful things that are going to happen, and peace and safety and all the rest of it, that they challenge us to say God has promised these things, but he hasn't brought them about yet, or he hasn't brought them about, or he hasn't brought them about in the way that it says there, but maybe he's brought them about in another way. E.g., so in Isaiah chapter 2, if you'll go there, and I say Isaiah and I'm not saying Isaiah, so you just have to put up with it because I'm English. Let's see. I think I got the right passage. My Bible is falling apart here. No, not that one. Try chapter 11. All right, that's the one. So Isaiah chapter 11, I'm going to read from verse 6 down. I'm going to then give you two interpretations. One of them is going to be the interpretation that is often given by Christian pastors and Christian professors and in Christian scholarly books. And the other one is the dumb one that I believe. So here it is. The wolf shall also dwell with the lamb. The leopard shall lie down with the young goat. The calf and the young lion and the fatling together, and the little child shall lead them. The cow and the bear shall graze. Their young ones shall lie down together. And the lion shall eat straw like the ox. The nursing child shall play by the cobra's hole. And the weaned child shall put his hand in the viper's den. They shall not hurt nor destroy in all my holy mountain. For the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord, as the waters cover the sea. Now, here's the scholarly interpretation. Remember, I said that you'll be confronted in the prophets with certain promises about a state of affairs that you have to do something with, you have to make a decision about. And this is the decision that many scholars have come to, okay? This is metaphor, it's imagery for the fact that when you come to Christ, when you believe in him, that you stop arguing with yourself, that the wolves and the bears and the nasty critters inside are ameliorated, and they are, what's a simpler word? They're nullified, and they're trained, and they become, thank you. And so you just come to this peace and this harmony within yourself. And so this is figurative language for that. Yeah? It can preach well, can't it? You're all screwing your noses up. But that's what I was taught in seminary, and that's what many of the commentaries say, and many of the scholars say that. Now here's a dumb interpretation. A dumb interpretation is that it means exactly what it says. Yeah. Now, okay, so if it's the first, it's fulfilled now. You don't have to wait around for it. You don't have to ask the question, well, how's that going to happen? And how can a wolf, you telling me that a wolf won't eat meat anymore and all of that stuff, yes? All of those questions. Well, they become non-questions because you have found a figurative center of that passage. And what Isaiah really means is that you stop arguing with yourself. Or it goes into the future. You put it into the future. And when you put it into the future, I hope that you can see that you have those problems. You're stuck with them, aren't you? In fact, it sounds a little bit, I don't know, childish to believe that. You don't really believe that this is going to literally happen, do you? That a little child's going to be leading around a lion and a bear and so on. I mean, that's a little bit, that's kind of like believing that there was a global flood, or that God created the world in 6 literal days or something like that. That's what we're told by these evangelical scholars today. That's all nonsense. It's all fanciful. It wasn't meant to be taken at face value. But please notice what you have to do there. You're confronted with a choice. And that is always an interpretative choice. One of them is to believe what it says, and if you believe what it says, then you have to put the fulfillment of the prophecy beyond our time. And you have to say that God's going to do some stuff, actually it ends up being a lot of stuff, that he hasn't done yet.
Yes.
Or, if you're impatient with that and you know that the church is the new Israel, then the church being the new Israel, we can jump on this verse, we can claim it as fulfilled today in a spiritual and wonderful and metaphorical way. And, we can preach our sermons on it, can't we? Yeah, I don't like it either, but it's done an awful lot. We're not going to be doing that in this class. And because we're not going to be doing it, what we're going to be doing, what we'll have to do, is that we'll have to accrue a great deal of this kind of material to build a picture of the expectation of the kingdom that is covenantally anchored, we'll see, but it's a kingdom that has not yet come. And there are promises and there are acts of God that are incumbent upon not the first coming of Christ, but the second coming of Christ. In fact, we'll see this too. We'll see that the prophets are more concerned, by and large, with the second coming of Christ than they are with the first coming. Have you noticed that? There is more attention given to what we call the second coming. Jesus coming in power and glory and coming to beat everybody up and squash everybody's heads and all of that stuff, and then set up a kingdom of peace after that. There's a great deal of information about that, and there's a great deal of information about the kingdom that he's going to set up. Was that a...
It was, but you told me not to ask questions.
Yeah, all right. You can in a minute. I saw that, though. Okay. But if you want to interpret this stuff by the first coming, that is by the cross and the resurrection of Christ, it sounds pious and you can make it sound very spiritual. But what you are going to be forced to do is bring all of that stuff that you would have to put into the future and bring it into the present, or actually bring it into the past at the cross. And when you do that, you are going to have to spiritualize much of the Old Testament, particularly the prophets. It is a choice between whether you're going to interpret the Bible by the first coming of Christ or by the second coming of Christ. And we're going to be confronted with that. We put an awful lot of emphasis and onus on the first coming of Christ, and so we should. But we'll see this too, that often in the Old Testament, the two comings of Christ are fused together as one work. In fact, when you take communion, they're fused together. Do you notice that? You know, you remember his body and his blood, but what? Until I come. Do you see that? So there's even a reminder there that the temptation to believe that everything's fulfilled at the first coming is a wrong temptation, because it's not. And you don't have to be a biblical scholar to know that, by the way. You just need to read the newspaper, don't you? Or look around you. God's not on his throne, and Christ is not on David's throne, and the church is not reigning. And things actually looking pretty dire for the church in the West. But if you look at it through the second coming, then I hope you can see there's a great deal that we can look forward to, a great deal that God's going to do. Yes?
I was going to ask, is it separated into two different comings in the Old Testament?
That's a good question.
I can't recall that.
I don't think so, John.
So is that why the disciples had such a hard time with?
Yes.
Where's the army? You know?
Yes. Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Well, yeah, or the time thing, you know.
Mm-hmm.
God's time and our time. It's just we're trying to figure it out in our little time.
Yeah.
It's big time.
Well, that's a very good point, actually, yes. We stumble through our days and through moments, and some moments don't last long enough, and some moments last far too long. I can remember being stuck in a job before I was saved. I was working in a stores where you had to label things. You put things in a bag and label them and put them in a kit, and then you did exactly the same thing with another kit day after day after day. And I did that for several years. This was before I was saved. I thought that I would never get out of that. I mean, I was 21, 22. I thought I'd never get out of this rut that I was in, okay? That this was going to be it. But I got out of it. I actually,
This too will pass.
I got promoted and, got on, became a buyer and all of these other things. And then God called me into the ministry, and my meteoric rise in the company was stopped. But that's a joke, by the way. It wasn't much of a meteoric rise. But I was getting noticed.
Time flies.
But time can be like that, can't it? To God, all of the history of the world is just a moment. It's just a short time. the short expanse of our lives, however long we're here, what is it in comparison to eternity? What is it in comparison to what our loved ones have entered into? What is it in comparison to where we'll all be? And that experience, it doesn't, yeah, you see, it's a very, very different thing, isn't it? All right. I'm going to skip the downward slide. I've said a little bit about it, but you all know the story, don't you? Yes? So it starts gloriously on Mount Sinai and it ends with the Benjamites chopping up a concubine, or I think it was Benjamites, and sending her parts to the different tribes. Okay? In the book of Judges. We have other low points like Israel bringing out the Ark of the Covenant against the Philistines. The Philistines at first are afraid because of their paganism. They believe that God is present there with them. But they overcome their fear and actually capture the Ark, and Israel loses the Ark of God. Eventually it's brought back. But the priests are, but the priests are so out of oh, come on. They have forgotten about their duties to such an extent that one of them, well, they put it on a cart that they shouldn't have done, and one of them actually touches the ark. I know that he thought that he had a good reason to do it, but God didn't agree with him and he died. Because as a priest, he should know that the Ark of the Covenant shouldn't be on a cart. It should be held on poles by the priests. So that's where we get to, and then we get Saul, and that goes pear-shaped, and then we get David, which is where we're going to start next time. My last thing that I need to do tonight, if you can bear with it, is to ask the question, what is a prophet?
Well,
Someone that
two
got
answers.
Two answers.
It could be someone who predicts, a person who predicts the
Mm-hmm.
future, or one who foretells the word of God.
That's pretty good.
Messenger?
He's in a sense, he's a messenger, in the sense of what Susie said, the second part, being a forth teller.
Is he a teacher?
But it's,
Yeah, he's a teacher, yeah.
it's through the inspiration of God, though, right? It's not just like,
Mm-hmm.
that's the thing, he's being inspired
Yeah.
through dream or whatever, right?
Yeah. That's all of that's good. But what is he basically?
Person.
I mean, if somebody claims to be a prophet, what are they claiming to do?
a man
Know
of
what
God.
God's
Share
speaking
God's
for.
truth. I mean, they
Well, I can share God's truth, but I don't claim to be a prophet.
I'm not the prophet of the
Representative.
Son of the prophet.
What?
A representative of God?
Well, I'm a representative of God. You're a representative of God.
I'm
Anointed.
dependent on.
Anointed.
Nope.
Someone that God has chosen to give special revelation that he is foretelling to
Foretell.
whomever.
So you guys want to say forth tell, don't you?
He is
Where'd you get that from?
They're not historians.
That's that old
He
English.
has a message to give to
They do. I mean, they do forth tell in a sense of, I'm going to ask you in a minute. What?
Present self.
We don't know what you're looking at.
Um,
What you're asking.
Why don't you tell us?
Hey, we want-
I'm trying to get you guys to think.
So, I mean, it's
We're gonna
just an
stone
order.
Just a minute. Just a minute.
they're
Just a
gonna be
minute.
stoned if they're not truthful.
Teacher.
Many of you want to say forth tell. Well, I can forth tell that doesn't make me a prophet. Okay? If it does, then if you think it does, then I'll see you later, and we'll work out arrangements for you being a follower of mine.
We'll go with foretell in that case.
But lots of people can foretell, can't they?
They can.
Now, it is true that the prophets did try to call the people of Israel back into line, particularly back into line to the Mosaic standards. They did do that. So in that sense, they were God-ordained people that did that. But if you want to know what a prophet is, then go to Deuteronomy 18. And the answer to the question is first put in the negative. Verse 20. So Deuteronomy 18, verse 20. But the prophet who presumes to speak a word in my name, which I have not commanded him to speak, or who speaks in the name of other gods, that prophet shall die. And if you say in your heart, how shall we know the word which the Lord has not spoken? When a prophet speaks in the name of the Lord, if the thing does not happen or come to pass, that is the thing which the Lord has not spoken. So I ask you again,
Oh, we knew that.
what is a prophet? Well, no, look at it.
It's the name of the Lord.
No,
Someone who proclaims the will of the Lord.
look at verse 22.
Okay, it says, when a prophet
Comes to
speaks
pass.
in the name of the Lord,
So what is he doing?
telling the truth.
If he's saying this is the word of the Lord,
He's speaking
and you've got to test him, how do you test him?
if it
Doesn't
comes
come
true or
true,
not.
he dies.
If what doesn't come true?
The
What he
prophecy,
said.
what he is prophesying.
What's another word for a prophecy then?
Word, message,
Prediction?
A seer.
He's predicting, yes. In fact,
Seer. That's
remember that it says in 1 Samuel that before, when it talked about Samuel, before the time of the prophets, they were known as seers into the future. Did you see? He's saying this is going to happen in the future. Well, how do you test him?
if it comes true or not.
Yeah. So what's he doing? He's predicting stuff, isn't he?
So how is that?
So the smart ones wait until a long time out. You forget about it.
Well, I'm going to get to that. How's that different
How is
than?
it different than foretelling?
It's not. It's not.
Okay.
But this bunch was saying forthtelling, and I wanted to make sure. I wanted to make sure.
Get that.
No, I said foretell.
Well,
Foretell.
well, blame them because that's what they were saying.
No, I
Look.
said foretell.
Did you?
Yes.
Well, it sounded like
You were hearing it in
forthtelling.
your accent.
It could be. It could be. All right. All right. Well, just look.
I speak up, if you speak in. Okay.
I'm sorry that that was an exercise in futility, wasn't it? But I hope that I made my point.
You did. Deuteronomy 18.
My point is that you test a prophet by what he said, whether what he says comes true, by whether he has the power to foretell the future. A false prophet, therefore, is somebody who, well, he does foretell, but what he says doesn't come through.
Right.
That's how you test a prophet. Therefore, the essence of what a prophet is somebody who predicts or foretells the future, which is what you said. I'm sorry, Susie. But the person next to you definitely said foretell. All right. What? I've nearly,
We knew that.
I've nearly finished. So what about if it's a long time? Because a lot of the prophecies are for a long time. Think about the predictions of Christ. A virgin shall conceive. Yes.
That's long.
Isaiah 53. The crucifixion passage there. Psalm 22. Micah 5:2 about he will be born in Bethlehem Ephratah. Yes. Many of those passages were long-range prophecies. In fact, as we will see when we enter into this, they combine the first and second comings, like you were saying earlier. So how do you test a prophet when he's long-range? In other words, when he just utters this stuff and then dies, and doesn't have the good manners to show up again when the church begins to spiritualize his prophecy. You test him, and the only way you can test his prophecy is whether it actually comes through the way he said it was to come through. If Isaiah, in Isaiah 11, predicted a time when the wolf will lie down with the lamb, then if he's a true prophet, that's what's going to happen. Do you see? If he's a false prophet, then that's not going to happen. But he is only a viable prophet of God if his words mean what they say, because that's the only way you can test them. Otherwise, a prophet could say, well, yeah, it came wrong that way, but I didn't mean it literally. I meant it spiritually, and spiritually it did come through true. Do you see? You're just too literal. In other words, there would be no way of testing a prophet unless the prophet could be tested on what he actually said. And that brings us back to, because prophets represent God, does God mean what he says? Okay? Because the prophets are not speaking for themselves, they're speaking for God. So when we go and we study the prophets here, we are studying people who first and foremost are called to prophesy, to predict. And we have got to decide to take them literally, to take them at face value, because that is what God wants us to do. That takes us back to God's character. It takes us back to the covenants, to the God's words, God's actions motif, which is so central to buoying up our spiritual lives, to making them meaningful, to encouraging us, to helping us to encourage other people. We don't want to be told a bunch of pink tea half-truths that sound frothy and frilly, but are found nowhere in the Bible. It's just somebody's, just a bunch of platitudes, basically, that someone is giving to us. What we need is that we need somebody to say, yeah, well, look what God says here about your situation. Look what God says about you. When I counsel people, I don't want to come with them with a bunch of effeminate froth to give to them. I want to give them truth, and I can only give them truth if I show it to them and say, God means this about you. God says, if you do this, if I do this, then good will come. If you don't do it, then things are going to go squirrely. So it's dependent. Everything is dependent. Our practical lives, our own spiritual lives, our reading of the Bible, and our understanding of the grand program of God from beginning to end It all depends on taking God at his word. That's what we're going to do, and hopefully that introduction will whet your appetite for next week. What we'll start doing next week is we'll look at the Davidic covenant, okay? If you have any questions, write them down and we'll deal with them at the beginning of next week's course, okay, our class. Do you have any questions right now, by the way? They're just dying to ask.
Should we read? Is there anything you want us to read?
2 Samuel chapter 7, 1 Chronicles chapter 17, Psalm 89.